Brightifyme Podcast. In this update from Brightifyme Podcast, we're covering the serious incident at LaGuardia Airport.
An air traffic control communication error preceded the deadly crash involving an Air Canada plane, highlighting the immense responsibility in aviation.
Our deepest condolences. Our thoughts are with the families of the pilots and everyone affected.
Subscribe now for more on aviation safety and the path to becoming a pilot.
Welcome to The Debate. So imagine hurtling through the dark at, roughly 150 miles per hour.
Right, in a heavy commercial jet.
Exactly. Outside your window, there is nothing but mist, light rain, and this really ragged 800-foot ceiling of clouds. You are a pilot, and you're trusting that the strip of wet concrete waiting for you in the blackness is clear.
But in this case, it isn't.
No, it isn't. Tonight, we are examining the catastrophic collision that occurred at LaGuardia Airport on March 22nd, 2026, just before midnight.
Right.
Jazz 646, which was an Air Canada CRJ 900 arriving from Montreal, struck a Port Authority fire vehicle designated Truck 1. This happened on Runway 4 at Taxiway Delta.
And it resulted in the tragic deaths of both pilots, as well as numerous injuries on the ground. It forces us to look at, where we place the blame when a highly engineered system shatters.
Yes, exactly. And the central intellectual tension we are unpacking is this. When ground collisions occur in aviation, are they the result of antiquated systemic procedures, specifically fractured communication protocols?
Or conversely, are they dictated by insurmountable environmental and kinetic truths? Things like weather, visibility, and the unforgiving physics of stopping a heavy jet.
Right. I will state my position clearly from the outset. I argue that this tragedy represents a fundamental systemic failure of air traffic communication protocols. I believe that operating ground vehicles and landing aircraft on separate, isolated radio frequencies creates a deadly siloing effect.
Which dismantled the safety net.
Exactly. It completely dismantled the see and avoid safety net that aviation relies on, making a collision the inevitable result of a flawed communication architecture.
Well, I come at it from a different way. While divided frequencies are a known limitation, the overriding causes here are environmental constraints and sheer kinetic reality. The poor visibility in light rain, the biological limitations of human depth perception in mist, and the stopping physics of a commercial jet on a wet runway meant that regardless of communication structures, the kinetic truths rendered this crash unavoidable once the sequence was set in motion.
Let's start with how the actors perceived their environment, because I think that explains why the primary safety doctrine of aviation completely failed that night. The bedrock of aviation safety is see and avoid, right?
Right. Pilots and ground operators are expected to maintain situational awareness visually.
But that doctrine was structurally compromised by the split radio frequencies. We siloed these frequencies for a reason, primarily to prevent radio stepping.
Which is what happens when two people talk at the exact same time on a half-duplex aviation radio.
Yeah, it emits this loud squeal and completely jams the frequency. So, to prevent congestion, the tower controller talks to the aircraft on one frequency, and ground control talks to the fire truck on a completely different one. But in doing so, we've created a fatal blind spot.
A silo.
Exactly. It is like an air traffic controller trying to direct a ballet where the dancers are, blindfolded and wearing earplugs, listening to two completely different songs.
Wow, that's a stark analogy.
But it fits. The tower sees the collision coming, but the actors on the stage are trapped in their own isolated realities. If the crew of Truck 1 had simply been on the same frequency and heard the landing clearance given to Jazz 646, they would never have requested to cross Runway 4 at Delta in the first place.
Well, hold on. A unified radio frequency doesn't actually fix the structural flaw of human biology. In that moment, you're assuming the firemen could process an auditory cue perfectly, while staring into a blindingly deceptive visual environment.
I think they could.
But the see and avoid doctrine wasn't just compromised by a radio dial. It was completely nullified by the atmosphere. We have to look at the exact atmospheric conditions at LaGuardia that night.
Right. It was raining.
6 statute miles of visibility with light rain, mist, and a ragged 800-foot overcast ceiling.
Sure. But commercial aviation operates in those weather conditions routinely. It is standard instrument flight rules weather.
They do. But you have to consider the mechanics of human perception when those conditions interact with the specific lighting infrastructure of an airport. People who don't spend time on the tarmac often imagine an airport runway at night looks like a well-lit interstate highway.
Flooded with overhead lights.
Exactly, but runways don't have overhead lights. They have embedded centerline lights and edge lights. These are strictly designed to outline the concrete for an aircraft on approach. They do not illuminate the surface itself or the surrounding grass.
So the truck is basically sitting in the dark?
Yes, Truck 1 is sitting in the dark. It is an aircraft rescue and firefighting vehicle. It has headlights and taillights, but very little side illumination. When the pilots of that CRJ-900 broke out of the cloud deck at 700 or 800 feet, they were looking into a dark void filled with mist.
Right.
Identification is impossible in these conditions. If looking out the window into a rainy, misty void provides zero situational awareness, doesn't that make a unified radio frequency the absolute only viable lifeline?
Not necessarily.
But relying on sight, when sight is predictably compromised by an 800-foot ceiling, is a systemic error in itself. The system designers know that seeing a void fails at night in the rain.
Yes, they do.
Therefore, the architectural choice to keep the fire truck and the landing jet on different frequencies isn't just a minor oversight. It is the active removal of the only redundant safety layer available to those crews.
The visual environment was so deceptive that even if they had redundant audio, it wouldn't have aligned with what their eyes were telling them. Let's look at the mechanism of why sight fails here.
Okay.
Think about the driver of Truck 1 looking down the approach path. When you look at a landing light through mist, the water droplets literally scatter the photons. Your brain relies on crisp edges to judge distance and speed.
And the mist blurs those edges.
Completely. It destroys your binocular vision and depth perception. That single landing light shining through the rain could be a massive Boeing 777 3 miles away, or it could be a smaller CRJ-900 right on top of you.
Right.
Firemen are not trained commercial pilots. They cannot accurately judge closure rate based on a diffused halo of light in the fog. The physics of light scattering and human perception were the true barrier here.
And this is my point, because they cannot judge the distance of those scattered photons. They require the auditory context even more.
How so?
If the fire crew hears the controller say, Jazz 646 cleared to land runway 4 in their headsets, they no longer have to guess the distance of a blurry light in the mist. They possess the objective reality that a jet is on short final.
I see what you mean.
By placing them on a separate ground frequency, we rob them of the one piece of context that cuts through the visual illusion.
Well, we can debate the theoretical benefits of unified frequencies all night, but we eventually have to transition from human perception to the brutal kinetic reality of what happens when two heavy objects occupy the same space.
Right.
The point of no return.
Precisely. Let's look at the unforgiving mechanics of this specific collision. The CRJ-900 touched down near the 2,000-foot mark of runway 4. In taxiway Delta, where Truck 1 was crossing, is situated only a third to a half of the way down that runway.
Which is remarkably close to the touchdown zone.
Yes, it is. If you are listening to this, you might be wondering why a multi-million-dollar aircraft can't just slam on its carbon brakes or hit the gas to fly away the moment the pilots realize there is an obstacle.
Right, why not just abort the landing?
Because once the aircraft's wheels hit the wet pavement, initiating a go-around in that short of a distance is physically impossible.
We need to define why that is impossible, because it comes down to the mechanics of the engines, right?
Exactly. You can't just step on the gas like you do in a Honda Civic. A commercial jet engine relies on massive titanium bypass fans and internal turbines. When a pilot pushes the throttle forward, it takes precious seconds for fuel to ignite in the combustion chamber, the internal turbines to spin up, and those massive N1 fans to actually bite into the air to generate thrust.
The spool-up time.
Yes, the spool-up time. By the time that physical process happens, a plane traveling at 130 knots has already eaten up hundreds of feet of runway. Initiating a go-around at that stage would have carried the aircraft directly into the side of the fire truck.
Airborne and full of fuel.
Exactly, likely at a higher energy state.
But let's talk about stopping. Why couldn't they just stop?
Because bringing a commercial airliner from landing speed to a complete halt before reaching taxiway Delta on a rain-slicked runway violates the laws of physics. The aircraft was estimated to be traveling at over 30 knots at the point of impact.
And we should note that NTSB data, automatic dependent surveillance broadcast, is great for tracking planes in the air, but on the ground, the data polling rate can lag.
Right, meaning they were likely going much faster than 30 knots. The mass of the aircraft, roughly 60,000 pounds, multiplied by its velocity, minus the drastically reduced coefficient of friction on wet concrete, yields a stopping distance that extends far beyond delta.
Because of the water.
Yes, wet concrete introduces viscous hydroplaning, where a thin film of water physically separates the rubber from the runway. They were mathematically doomed to strike that truck the moment the main gear compressed.
I understand the deterministic physics once the wheels are on the ground. The kinetic energy equation is inescapable. But I challenge this entirely deterministic view by focusing on the timeline leading up to that touchdown.
Okay.
Specifically, the timing of the air traffic controller's realization of the error. We have the transcript. The controller recognized the impending disaster. He shouted, "Stop, stop, stop, truck one, stop, stop, stop."
Yes, he clearly recognized the runway incursion.
Now trace the causality of that moment. Had the radio frequency been unified, that panic transmission, that raw, desperate command to stop, would have been instantly heard by the pilots of Jazz 646 in their headsets.
Right.
And crucially, it would have been heard before they entered their landing flare. The flare is that maneuver right before touchdown where the pilot pitches the nose up to settle onto the runway.
I'm following you.
If you hear a controller screaming for a vehicle on your runway to stop while you are still at 100 feet of altitude, you don't execute the flare. You don't touch down.
You abort.
Yes. You immediately firewall the throttles and initiate a bulked landing, abruptly aborting the touchdown sequence at the very last second while you still have airspeed and altitude. By isolating the frequencies, the controller had to make a choice of who to talk to.
He tried to stop the truck.
Exactly. And the pilots heard nothing but dead air on their frequency until it was too late. Unified communications altered the kinetic equation by triggering the go-around before the tires ever touched the wet pavement.
Well, you're assuming a perfectly rational, instant processing of information in a highly dynamic, adrenaline-fueled environment. The controller is operating under immense pressure, acting as a manual relay switch between two disconnected realities.
True.
Even if the pilots heard "stop truck one," there is zero guarantee that in the critical 3 seconds of the landing flare, they would instantly parse that the command was directed at a vehicle on their active runway at their specific taxiway intersection.
It takes cognitive processing time.
Exactly. It takes time to interpret a sudden radio shout meant for someone else.
But it provides a data point. It introduces friction into their expectation that the runway is clear. Right now, the system provides 0 data points. It enforces silence right up to the moment of impact.
Even if the pilots had heard the warning, rejected the landing, and somehow mashed the brakes before Delta, the runway itself was laying a trap for them further down.
What do you mean?
Let's talk about the thermodynamic nightmare that is LaGuardia's Runway 4. We are looking at infrastructure and physical limitations that operate at the absolute limit of safety margins before anyone even picks up a microphone.
You were talking about the pier structure over Flushing Bay.
Exactly. The rollout end of Runway 4 at LaGuardia isn't built on solid dirt. It is a pier built out over the water. Any experienced pilot operating out of LGA respects this feature.
Because it creates a thermodynamic trap.
Right. It's the classic bridge freezes before road effect. Because a structure suspended over water lacks the geothermal heat mass of solid ground and has cold air flow passing directly underneath it, it cools much faster.
Wow.
Moisture from the bay sweeps up over the runway and that pier surface gets exceptionally slick, sometimes icing up well before the rest of the concrete.
Well, to be precise with the timeline and the source material, they struck the fire truck at taxiway Delta, which is physically located before the aircraft ever reached that pier structure over the water.
That is correct. They never reached the pier. But the causality here is vital. I bring this up to emphasize the sheer hostility of the environmental constraints they were operating within. It proves that the margins for error on a wet night at LaGuardia are practically non-existent. Even if the truck hadn't been at Delta, if the pilots had heard the radio call, touched down, and had to brake aggressively further down the runway to avoid a delayed incursion, they would have hit that super slick pier surface.
Where braking action degrades
Drastically. Into total hydroplaning, the physical environment is so constrained, so incredibly unforgiving, that systemic procedures are often just a thin veneer over a fundamentally precarious kinetic reality.
You are arguing that the environment was an insurmountable trap. I look at the extreme nature of that physical environment, the poor visibility, the wet runway, the treacherous thermodynamics of the pier, and I draw the exact opposite conclusion.
Really?
Yes, it is precisely because the environment is so hostile that human communication infrastructure must be flawless. And we have objective proof from this very incident that human performance can be brilliant under pressure, provided the humans are allowed to communicate.
You're referring to the local controller's actions in the seconds following the collision.
I am. Let's look at the human element managing this infrastructure. The tower controller, immediately after witnessing a horrific, fatal collision on his runway, shifted his focus instantly to the trailing aircraft to prevent a secondary disaster.
Right, he had to secure the airspace.
He ordered Frontier Flight 4195, which was taxiing, to stop. Then he immediately keyed the mic for the aircraft on approach right behind the CRJ 900. He said, "Delta 263, go around runway heading 2000.
And when they hesitated?
When Delta 263 didn't execute the maneuver immediately, he didn't freeze. He followed up with a second authoritative go-around command. He kept his wits under unimaginable, heart-pounding pressure.
He did.
He secured the airspace, closed the airport, and prevented a pileup. I think this proves that the human operators were functioning at peak efficiency. The humans did everything right in the aftermath, which fiercely indicts the fractured radio system.
How so?
The controller was a highly capable operator who was betrayed by an antiquated communication architecture that forced him to choose who to save.
I will not dispute that the controller's performance in the immediate aftermath was the highest standard of air traffic control. Keeping your cognitive faculties intact, compartmentalizing the trauma to secure the airspace, it is commendable.
It is incredible.
But his success in managing the trailing aircraft doesn't prove that unified frequencies would have prevented the initial crash. Let's look at the physics of why he succeeded with the Delta flight.
Okay.
It proves that when dealing with aircraft in the air, where kinetic energy works in your favor, where a plane has the altitude, the uninterrupted airflow over the wings, and the airspeed to execute a go-around, human commands work.
Because they are still flying.
Right, the Delta flight was still airborne, but once Jazz 646 crossed the threshold and committed its weight to the wet pavement, the laws of kinetic energy took over. Human error or procedural delays of even a fraction of a second cannot be out-communicated when dealing with 60,000 pounds of metal moving at 130 knots on a slick surface.
See, you were continually starting your timeline of inevitability too late. You are starting the clock when the wheels touch down and the kinetic energy transfers to the pavement.
And where do you start it?
I am starting the clock minutes earlier, when Truck Guian picked up the microphone on the ground frequency to ask for clearance to cross the runway.
I see.
If the system allows a single point of failure, a single misunderstood clearance across two isolated frequencies to place a fire truck and a passenger jet on an inescapable collision course in zero visibility conditions, the system architecture is broken.
But the weather?
The physics of the wet runway are just the executioner. The communication silo is the judge and the jury.
And I counter that the weather and the visual limitations are the judge and jury. Run a thought experiment with me.
All right.
If it were a clear, sunny Tuesday afternoon, the divided frequencies would not have resulted in a collision. The pilots of the CRJ 900 would have seen a massive, bright lime green fire truck on the runway from 3 miles out on their approach.
Sure, they would have seen it.
And the truck driver would have looked out his side window and clearly seen a commercial jet on short final. The see and avoid doctrine would have worked perfectly, bridging the gap created by the siloed communications.
Because the visibility was perfect.
Exactly. It is the introduction of severe atmospheric constraints, the photon scattering mist, the 800-foot ceiling, the darkness, that activated the latent procedural flaws. Therefore, the physical environment is the primary driver.
It seems we are looking at the exact same sequence of kinetic events and identifying a completely different prime mover. Let's summarize our positions based on the mechanics we've discussed.
Okay.
I maintain that while the weather was undeniably atrocious, it is exactly during such extremes that fragmented communication channels rob crews of the situational awareness needed to survive. When visual safety nets fail due to mist and darkness, a unified radio frequency is the vital, required redundancy.
And I maintain that extreme weather, the optical destruction of depth perception at night, and the strict physical laws governing turbine spool-up times and wet concrete braking distances create scenarios where procedural flaws simply cannot be out-communicated. The kinetic environment dictated the tragic outcome before the pilots even knew they were in danger.
Well, regardless of where we place the ultimate weight of the cause, we both clearly converge on the compounding tragedy of this event. It is a stark reminder of the unforgiving margins in aviation.
It truly is. And there is a haunting historical parallel here that is impossible to ignore when looking at the source material.
Oh, right. The date.
Yes, this accident occurred on March 22nd, 2026. Exactly 34 years to the day prior. On March 22nd, 1992, LaGuardia experienced its last fatal accident.
U.S. Air Flight 406.
Right. A Fokker F-28 that lost lift due to ice on the wings during a takeoff roll went off runway 13 and crashed into Flushing Bay, killing 27 people.
March 22, exactly 34 years to the day. It is a chilling parallel that really underscores the continuous, generation-spanning effort to secure these incredibly complex transportation hubs against failure.
And it shows that despite 3 decades of technological advancement, we are still wrestling with the exact same inherent vulnerabilities: severe weather, the limits of human perception, and the inescapable physics of heavy machinery.
Absolutely. It is clear that aviation safety will require a deep, unflinching reevaluation of how procedural systems and environmental physics interact in these critical edge case scenarios.
I agree completely.
We have to decide if we are going to continue building architectural dams that isolate critical operators to prevent radio chatter, or if we will integrate our systems so that everyone shares the same reality. Because as we've explored today, when the ballet dancers are blindfolded and the central controller is overwhelmed, the silence between those radio frequencies can be deafening. We leave you, the listener, to ponder which factor, the procedural communication silos or the insurmountable kinetic environment, demands the most immediate reform. Thank you for joining us.
Dreaming of flying across the world? Not just India, but Paris, London, Dubai. An ESA license is your passport to global skies. Recognized in 31 countries and accepted by airlines worldwide. Train in Europe with modern aircraft, multicultural exposure, and the world's highest safety standards. And yes, you can always convert back to DGCA if you choose to return. Confused about costs, universities, or visa process? We're here to help for free. Hurry! Click the link below to register for your free one-on-one consultation today. Limited seats available. Your global cockpit awaits.